On behalf of Rutgers, I want to welcome you to one of our annual, very anticipated events, the Susan and Michael J. Angelides Lecture. Welcome. The Institute for Women's Leadership and our 9 consortium members, I'm not going to name them because they're listed on the back of your program, so very impressive, be sure to read. Our 9 consortium members are known nationally and internationally for our work to advance women's education and leadership, and for faculty scholarship focused on women's and gender studies, on violence prevention, women in work, women in politics, the arts, science, and global activism. We are extremely grateful to the generosity, of Susan and Michael Angelides. They gave the gift to establish an endowment so that every year we can bring distinguished speakers to campus who are making change. It's because of them that we are able to welcome to Rutgers such distinguished media leaders as Michel Martin, Rebecca Traister, and Farai Chideya. We're so glad you're here. We need this timely and relevant conversation about the complicated world of women, media, and politics. So thank you for coming. As we all know, it takes more than dollars to put together an opportunity like this. It takes a team, and I want to thank first our partners in this endeavor. The Center for American Women in Politics, you'll be hearing from their director, Debbie Walsh, shortly. The School of Communication and Information, Dean Jonathan Potter, right here, thank you. And the Department of Women's and Gender Studies, Abby, Busia, and many here, thank you so much. We have had great fun working together, and we will be continuing. Many thanks as well to our Institute staff, especially Rachel Bernstein and Emily Herron, who worked so hard to organize this event, managing many, many details with energy, creativity, and enthusiasm. Thank you. Thank you both. Where's Emily? Before introducing Debbie Walsh, who will introduce our conversation moderator, Michel Martin, I want to note that tonight stands out for many reasons. About 5 years ago, our late Institute for Women's Leadership director, Allison Bernstein, had the vision of creating at Rutgers the first ever endowed chair in media, culture, and feminist studies. And she had the idea to name that chair for Gloria Steinem, who led the way in harnessing media for social change. Allison saw the chair as the heart of a major university initiative to address the need for more diverse, democratic, and inclusive media. Tonight, we are within reach of our goal of raising $3 million to endow the Gloria Steinem Chair. Now you notice I said within reach. If you'd like to help us get to the finish line, please see me. We are also have launched today a crowdfunding site to raise the last $150,000, and you can go on our website, and it's making giving easy, one.rutgers.edu, Gloria Steinem Chair. Now to get to this evening's program. It was, in addition, Alison Bernstein's idea to devote our first program of the Steinem Initiative to the topic of women, media, and politics. It was, as she used to say, a no-brainer, because we were heading into the 2016 presidential campaign, and we were imagining the possibility of a first woman president. We did not imagine the ways ideas about women and power would become front and center during the campaign and all that has happened since. It is now my pleasure to introduce Debbie Walsh, Director of the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. Debbie is that often quoted expert on women in politics. You read her commentary in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in the Star Ledger, in the Guardian, and you often catch her big picture observations when you're listening to NPR. We are so grateful for the work Debbie and the Center are doing to keep us aware, informed, and hopeful for the future of women's political leadership. Thank you, Debbie.
Lisa, thank you so much. It has really been wonderful for all of us at the center to work with you and Rachel and Emily, but I also want to acknowledge my colleague Kelly Dittmar, who has played a really important role in shaping today's program. As you can imagine, women, media, and politics is a topic right in our lane at the Center for American Women in Politics. Although we have a history of more than 4 decades of following elections, the 2016 election cycle was unlike any other for us. Along with our friends and partners at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, we spent more than 19 months deeply engaged in a new project, Presidential Gender Watch 2016, tracking, analyzing, and illuminating gender dynamics in what most of us anticipated would be an historic election, possibly resulting in the first woman president. Now we all go, oh. This work entailed applying a gender lens to campaigns, candidates, voters, and of course the media. Tonight's program allows us to take a deeper dive on the gender implications of the media's coverage of politics with 3 of the best thinkers from that world. And it is really my privilege to introduce our moderator, who will in turn present her colleagues. Michel Martin is the weekend host of NPR's All Things Considered. You can find her reporting the news, but also hosting her weekly barbershop conversation, explaining words we're hearing, or finding surprising stories at South by Southwest. Michelle came to NPR in 2006 and launched Tell Me More, a 1-hour daily news and talk show. She's also served as a contributor and substitute host for NPR shows, including Talk of the Nation and News and Notes. Her more than 25-year career as an award-winning journalist began in print with major newspapers, including the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post. She joined NPR from ABC News, where she was a correspondent for Nightline and won an Emmy for her work on the news magazine Day One. She's been a regular panelist on the PBS series Washington Week and a contributor to Now with Bill Moyers. A Brooklyn native, Michelle graduated from Radcliffe College. What did you say? Oh, yes. Okay, I missed it. Me too. Radcliffe College at that place, Harvard University, and earned a master's degree from the Wesley Theological Seminary just in 2016. 2 years ago, COP was very fortunate to welcome her to Rutgers as the Senator Winona Lippman Lecturer in Women's Political Leadership, where she encouraged all Americans to have real conversations that involve as much listening as talking. When it comes to having those real conversations, asking questions and probing for understanding, few can match the talents of Michel Martin. Once we decided to present this program, she was the first, second, and third on our list of possible moderators, precisely because of her skill in connecting to people and their stories. Most recently, that skill has been on display in her series Going There, in which she takes the studio to the story, talking to all kinds of people, both experts and regular folks, about stories as challenging as getting real about race, exploring who needs college, or assessing the future of water. Michele is an insightful and thoughtful journalist who listens closely because she is genuinely curious herself. She really does want to know more. And tonight, all of us want to know much more about women, media, and politics. And so it is my great honor to present Michel Martin.
Can you just follow me around and introduce me to people? Not that there's any pressure at all now. Hello. Thank you all so much for coming out. It is a pleasure to be back at Rutgers, and it is truly an honor to be asked to kick off this important series of conversations which begins tonight, and as I understand, goes all day tomorrow. And it's a very exciting moment in all of our lives, to put it mildly. And I could not be more excited to spend this evening with all of you and with my two co-conspirators here. And the reason I say it that way is that I hope this will be a conversation that includes all of us, or as many of us as wish to be involved. We will start the conversation here, but we hope that it very quickly moves here. To those of you who are watching via live stream, we'll figure it out. I'm sure there's a Twitter handle or something that we can use to figure out how to, what is it, by the way? Is there a Twitter handle where we can figure out? Is it R? Did you write it down somewhere? Okay. Oh, that's a long hashtag. It's, okay, hashtag. It's RU4, and that's the letter R, letter U, 4, numeral 4, feminist media. So join the conversation. We'll figure out how to get you in the mix if you're on stream. And if you're shy, we hope you'll get over it. But if you're really shy and you're sitting here, join the hashtag and we'll get you in that way. But use it as a spiritual exercise and get over yourself and just get in the conversation. You know, I was thinking in preparation for coming here, you know, what words to use to describe our magnificent panel of interlocutors. And there's author, you know, commentator, analyst, pundit. And if you're really honest with yourself, and you know that this is, it's not even intentional or conscious, but if you close your eyes and think author, commentator, analyst, pundit, who comes to mind? And if we're honest with ourselves, it probably isn't people who look like us. And yet, you know, I find that the trenchant writing on the politics of the moment and the politics of throughout time very often are kicked off by our two authors, commentators, analysts, and pundits. You know, together they've analyzed current trends and they've drawn, you know, deep connections between ideas and people in ways that other people, frankly, have not seen. They were often the first to get to stories that everybody followed later. So perhaps they can offer us tonight, no pressure, ladies, a roadmap into what is coming next. We'll see. So let me start by bringing them up with no further ado. Let me start with Rebecca Traister. She is writer-at-large for New York Magazine, the author of the New York Times bestseller, All the Single Ladies, Unmarried Women, and The Rise of an Independent Nation. Her previous book, Big Girls Don't Cry, was a Times Notable Book of 2010. She's written for more publications than we can count. She's a winner of the 2016 Hillman Prize for Analysis and Opinion Journalism. Please welcome Rebecca Traister. We're so glad to have you. Farai Chideya. What can I say about this magnificent person who also went to the H? I'm not the only one. She's a little after me. She's actually returned to the homeland as a fellow. She's a fellow. Why is it a fellow? I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be mean. Couldn't it be a fella? But she's there at the Shorenstein Center, Harvard Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy. She's studying media coverage of the 2016 election, because there's nothing to say about that. And she's been a senior writer covering politics and data at the 538. She's the author of 6 books, the most recent of which is 2016's The Episodic Career, How to Thrive at Work in the Age of Disruption. You've heard her voice, you've seen her, and she's a former host at National Public Radio, and she's sometimes nice enough when I can get her to answer the phone to fill in for me. So please welcome Farai Chideya. I'll walk over here now. All right.
Thank you.
So you know what I thought would be fun is if we actually started by, because our subject is journalism and the media writ large and politics, and so I actually thought it would be fun to start by asking you why you did get into journalism to begin with. Farai, what did you think it was for?
Well, I wanted to be a novelist, and my mom told me to get a job. So, and I'm not even kidding. It gets more inspiring from there. But my parents had both been journalists. My father is from Zimbabwe. He's now passed away, and my mother, who's quite healthy, may she long be. They met at the Newhouse School at Syracuse, and they started a newspaper in Zambia before I was born, which was shut down by the government. So, in all of the family lore is don't take the press for granted. Don't take press freedoms for granted. But I was in college and I was doing art and wanted to write novels, but I knew what words were, but I didn't really know what narrative was. But I got an internship at Newsweek magazine, and I remember once, I was kind of like a semi-punk rock chick, and I remember walking into a women's prison, and the women there who met me, the sort of social workers, were just like, they were very positively impressed, but they were like, that's not really what I thought of as a Newsweek reporter. And then I just had such a great time going around this women's prison and it was a minimum security prison, but people felt very genuine when they talked to me, and I was like, oh, you can actually get people to talk about hard stuff and they'll tell you about it. And I was completely hooked.
Rebecca, what about you?
I got into journalism by accident. I actually grew up thinking of it as like the most glamorous career on earth, and one from which there was no way that I would become a journalist. Like the idea of getting paid to write something that had your name on it felt like the equivalent of being a movie star when I was a kid. I grew up in a very book-oriented house. My dad is a rare book librarian. My mom is an English professor. And they're both actually recently retired. And I grew up in a house that had 40,000 books. It had nothing else in it except for books. The furniture was made of books. And the idea of being a writer just felt, I don't know why it felt so remote. I'm an ambitious person. I was an ambitious girl. It felt like a glamour I wouldn't necessarily achieve. And I went to Northwestern University, which has a tremendous journalism school. And even as an undergraduate, my friends who were in journalism school, I was like, wow, that is a cool career. But it never occurred to me that it was one that I would pursue. And I studied English and American studies and thought a lot about literature. I was very interested in feminism, but it was also a period, I'm 42, and the period that I was in high school and college, the 90s, was this sort of deep freezer of anti-feminist backlash. There was no feminism on my campus. I mean, I was also at a fairly apolitical school in the Midwest, but there was not feminism. There was a Take Back the Night march, but it wasn't. But if you had gone to that march and said, "Hey, who here is a feminist?" Nobody would have raised their hand. And I was interested in it and cared about it very much, and cared about the politics of the left, very roughly defined, sort of from my own, which I had inherited from my own family. But I never sort of imagined that there would be a professional outlet for that for me. And so after college, I went off and didn't really know what I was doing. I moved to New York and worked in retail and tried to get other kinds of jobs. And I got a job as an assistant to an actor, which I did for a couple of years. Harvey Keitel, I was his assistant for a while. It's a weird into journalism story. And then through...
Yeah, I'm trying to find the through line there.
Yeah, no, you're gonna get it in 2 seconds. And then because I was working with sort of movie people, there was a magazine that was being launched in part by Harvey Weinstein that was gonna be edited by Tina Brown called Talk Magazine, and I got a job as an assistant there, as a secretary at that magazine. And there I met people who were journalists, and they thought that I told stories well. This particular story isn't a great example of my great storytelling. And they got me helped me to get an entry-level job at the New York Observer, where I started as a fact checker. And it was there that I got my entire education in what journalism was. And it was this very snarky weekly paper that was best known for a long time as where Sex and the City was published. As a weekly column, is now best known as the paper that was once owned by Jared Kushner, though not when I worked there. And I really learned journalism there, but it was very much an old boys club, and there was no sense that I was ever going to write anything about politics. It was just, there was not a sense that that would be anything that anybody would want me to do. And at some point I got a job online at salon.com working for female editors, and I sort of just started covering the stuff I was writing, including entertainment coverage, just from a feminist perspective. And people were excited about it, and my editors were excited about it. And then I got to make my own beat.
So this leads me to where I wanted to go, because each of you has distinguished yourself for writing about gender and race or both. And I was interested in what got you started in that, and what got you started thinking that this was something to write about. Farai, I'm going to start with you, because you were actually one of the first people to write about politics and pop culture. In fact, it's Pop and Politics, the Pop and Politics blog, which ran for
10 years.
10 years.
Yeah, I started it in 1995. I saw blogs.
Right.
I had friends who were in computing. Omar Wasso, who taught Oprah how to use the internet, was a friend of mine, and ran a small, BBS, a bulletin board service called New York Online, and he taught me to do basic HTML coding so I could start my own blog in 1995, and it was incredible to just sort of self-publish. And I wrote one piece. I still have the archives on a hard drive somewhere, but I wrote one piece for the Pop and Politics blog that got a lot of notice during the '96 campaign called "What is the Sound of One Hand Clapping? The Story of Black Republicans." Because I had gone to like the saddest. There was like I was at the '96 Republican convention, and there was this gathering in a corner of like 5 Black Republicans, and it was like the official Black Republican event. And I was like, okay, I've just got to go all in on this,
But exactly. But
and there's actually quite a few Black Republicans in my family, which, my family, part of this is that my family, it's not just that my mom went to journalism school, but my family, which is a working class Black Catholic family, has strains of liberalism, authoritarianism. Like you've got, we have what I call the annual Thanksgiving fight, which is that we eat dinner, then we fight about a socio-political topic, and then we make up over pie. And my family makes excellent pies, so there's no hard feelings. And so one year it's abortion, one year it's transgender identity, one year it's should you shoot drug dealers on sight? Because I'm not even kidding. Because it's like, my family has a ton of military, and we're actually multiracial through marriage and birth, and we just go all in, and it's great to realize that you could go all in. 2 of my uncles who both served in Vietnam had totally different experiences there and would kind of refight the Vietnam War. It was a culturally imperialist, blah, 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 blah. It's like, but the American government needed to do it. It's like, and it's great. I learned that you could respectfully disagree. And even when I have very strong feelings, I hope that we can respectfully disagree. Now is not so much a time in American politics for that.
But one of the things I was curious about is, how did you realize that these things were stories? It's interesting how many women reporters that I've talked to and met over time who have said, my life is a story, but nobody wants to hear it. Or the stories, so often the stories that pertain to issues of gender in particular are hiding in plain sight. And I'm just interested in how you either developed your voice or realized these are, in fact, stories.
I was empowered by my mother, and when I was 16 years old, I wrote essentially what is the equivalent of an op-ed for 17 magazine on South Africa and apartheid. And I didn't remember this, but my mom said, and I didn't even know you submitted it. And one day you said you got a $500 check for writing this, and I was excited that you published it and for the money, And it's like, but she's the one who told me, like, you have a voice, you can get out there. It's like it was just a given in my family, and it's not because we were economically privileged. It was just like we understood that whatever you can express of yourself. My family's full of not just military people, but visual artists and writers. My grandmother wrote for the Baltimore African American, which is the black newspaper there, like in the 40s and 50s. And so we just sort of, that's what we did, is we expressed ourselves. And I realize how unusual it is now, but it was taken for granted in some ways in my family.
Rebecca, what about you? Because one of the questions I was going to ask is, did you find resistance when you first started framing stories in the way that you wanted to frame them?
Well, I think it's interesting because I had that first journalism experience at the New York Observer, where my job was expressly not about politics, and where I was taught the mechanics of journalism, things like on the record, off the record, how to track down sources, the very basics, the plumbing of journalism. The message I was also given, and at this point I was in my mid-20s, and I was not empowered. I mean, for no particularly good reason. My parents, I was intellectually encouraged and empowered and encouraged to be ambitious, but I had never been told that my voice and my story was particularly valuable and should be out there. And the message that I got at my first journalism job was, no one cares what you think. You have to learn to do the reporting. And it's interesting, that was great training for me, because it did teach me the rules. And a lot of journalism and a lot of storytelling, in part, is learning how to put the pipes together, right? And so that was good for me, but it really got ingrained in me. Nobody cares what you think. And in that same era, that newspaper was independent, and everybody was paid very badly. And in my effort to get freelance work so that I could pay my bills, it was fascinating because the market for a 20-something, and I was writing at that time at the Observer about the film business, and they had me being a gossip columnist, things like that. The market for freelance work was write about your sex life. It was the Sex and the City era, that it was on television, and everybody, all the women's magazines wanted me to write first-person stories about my sex life as a 20-something woman in New York. Now, I had no sex life as a 20-something woman in New York. This is absolutely true. And I would just regularly disappoint these people who wanted me. And it was an incredible market situation. It really was. The one freelance assignment I was offered that I took, and this was so out of my lane, they wanted me to review sex toys for Allure magazine, for which they paid me enough money that I paid my bills and my credit card debt, and I did it. But otherwise, they only wanted me if I were gonna tell stories about like my martini drinking, which club hopping. So that was the early message I got about my particular story, and a particularly gendered lens on that. So then when I went to Salon and started to write things, again, just sort of tried out using my point of view and my voice, the idea that somebody might care what I thought about something. And I started to write about things I was interested in. Again, there was encouragement in part, I believe, because it really was a female-heavy infrastructure at Salon editorially, and that remains very rare. I've never worked at a place where I had so many women editors as that period at Salon, and I think that makes a difference. But I will tell you also that the more cynical view is that it was a moment in which readers were beginning to be interested in feminist coverage again. And so it was getting page views. I could have had all the women editors in the world, and if people weren't reading the stories that were coming from a feminist point of view, nobody would have encouraged me to keep doing that. But because it was a moment where this was beginning to come back into vogue, and this is sort of 2003, 2004, that's what gave me the encouragement to keep developing my voice. And thinking and learning. I had to learn about feminism. I had to learn about race. I had things I didn't, and I still am, because this wasn't something that I was trained in. It's been a lot of ongoing education for me in learning how to tell the stories that I'm most excited about telling.
And this is where I just want to say the name Shirley Chisholm, who was a guest of Rutgers, was one of the first people to offer the Hillman Lectures. The first Lippmann lecturer. So this is the point at which I want to lift up the name of Shirley Chisholm, who was the first black candidate for a major party nomination, the first woman to run for the Democratic Party nomination. And interestingly enough, her candidacy came 100 years after the first woman, Victoria Woodhull, tried to run for president at a time when obviously women didn't even have the right to vote. So many people, and she was also younger than 35, which is another interesting sort of detail. So she was not particularly appreciated on any number of levels. for many people, people tell me that, Shirley Chisholm's campaign for the presidency was a wake-up call for many, many people. She had a staff that was overwhelmingly, when she was in Congress, overwhelmingly women, because she realized that these were an underutilized resource, people who knew everything, they knew every nook and cranny of the Hill, and none of them got the credit for it. And she was one of the first people to make women her chief of staff and to make them legislative directors and give them the credit that they would do. So for many people, it was a wake-up call. For other people, it was kind of business as usual. A lot of talk about her appearance. Who does she think she is? What is she doing here?
Including black men in the Democratic Party.
Including black men and so forth.
And
So
feminists.
and feminists. You're wasting our time. You're going to waste our vote, and so forth. And so, okay, so wake-up call for either of you in terms of framing politics, feminism, how you think about it, how you write about it, sort of talk about it. Farai?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I kind of caught the Shirley Chisholm bus late. I knew about her, but I didn't really pay that much attention to her until Shala Lynch's excellent documentary, Unbought and Unbossed. And then I started going back and really studying more about her. And she, I think, really understood. And I had a chance to interview her once when I was at NPR. And I think
see, now I'm really mad at you. Now I'm really jealous and upset.
She was an amazing person. But I think she really understood that her candidacy was doomed, but isolated that in a part of her mind so she could run with complete vigor and gusto at the same time. And that's amazing. It's like that the whole world is out to just set your platform on fire. And she was betrayed by members of the Congressional Black Caucus, but she was just like, I'm just going to play all the cards I have until I have no more cards. And I really admired that about her.
Did she ever talk to you about the media coverage? Did she ever talk about how she was treated in the media, or was that a secondary issue then? Did she not see it as pivotal to her campaign?
I don't believe we spoke about it, but I think she certainly did. Yeah, she definitely was very well aware that she was being covered as an oddity, as a funny-looking school teacher with a funny accent from Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm. Rebecca?
There's another great documentary that actually I got to write about 2 summers ago. It was Unearthed. It's called The Year of the Woman, and it's a documentary that was made at the 1972 convention where Chisholm's name was in nomination and she spoke, and it was also where the National Women's Caucus met in 72. And a documentary crew of women, all women, were sent down, including Barbara Koppel, who was just out of film school. It's an incredible documentary. It is very much of its moment. But speaking of the media coverage, it was so inspiring to me, and right now I'm working on a book about women and anger in politics, and I realize it's been something that I've been thinking about since I saw that documentary, in part because there is a scene of Flo Kennedy. I don't know if people here know who Flo Kennedy is. She's a feminist speaker, a lawyer, incandescent presence, and there's a scene in which she's leading a group of women on the convention floor, yelling at the white men of the media, including Dan Rather, including the 60 Minutes guys and their cameramen, for not covering the women and not covering Chisholm. And she is profane and furious and hilarious. I mean, she was one of the great speakers, great orators, and also frank and funny, and just, you look up Flo Kennedy.
She was a co-conspirator of Gloria Steinem's.
Yes,
as well.
a frequent speaking partner of Gloria Steinem. And and that scene, and it's the anger that she felt free to show. I mean, it lit me up when I watched this video 2 years ago going into the 2016 campaign. And I wrote a story in which I actually said, we need a little bit more of this anger, which we seem to have trouble accessing right now. And of course, it's very complicated for women to express anger and be warmly received, as we have just seen in slow motion for the past 2 years. And that's actually one of the
because I was going to actually talk about 2008, but I kind of have the feeling, you know what I mean? I wanted to talk about 2008 because 2008 was so many things. I mean, it was so many things. It was too much for some people, too little for other people. But then I kind of feel everybody really wants to talk about 2016. Yes. So what do you think? Should we just skip right to 2016? What do you think? And then if you have more to say about 2008, because nothing happened in 2016 at all. So, oh yay. So this is where, but before we get to 2016, Rebecca, this is where I have to get on you, because the title of your first book, the subtitle was "The Election That Changed Everything for American Women." Really?
Yeah, no.
Did you blow it?
No.
What'd you miss?
Well, I mean, I will. The only thing I'll say in defense of that subtitle is that it did say "change, not fixed," and also that I was not in favor of that subtitle. That was a dramatic flourish of my publishers, and it. I actually do think that 2008 changed a lot about how we talk about gender and race and class. It very clearly did not change enough. This election and the way in which Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama were discussed there were differences. We had gone beyond what was happening in 2008, which was like her pantsuits and like she sounds like everybody's angry ex-wife. The thing I did not anticipate and should have was that in getting beyond that very sort of more easily identifiable and describable version of how you diminish a woman running for office, that we learned that we can't do that, like a lot of people learn, not everybody, that you can't do that like on NBC anymore, right? Which did happen in 2008. If you look back at the way that people on major networks talked about Hillary Clinton in 2008, it's sort of your jaw will hang open, and it was not that this time. But what I failed to take into account is that the attitudes wouldn't disappear, that they would become more subtle and thus harder to call out. And I knew it was going to be bad going in. I actually did not want Hillary Clinton to run for president again this time.
Really? Why? Because can you even?
Yeah. I had this feeling that it might end badly. I think that I worried. I have tremendous respect for her. I admire her very much. I actually think she would have made a terrific president. I think she would have been great at the job. I think that she had come to mean too much for too many to bear a symbolic load that she could not, and that no one should bear. I think that one of the problems with being these exceptions, the exceptional symbol of underrepresented populations, gravely underrepresented populations, is that everybody wants to read themselves onto you, and that it happened to her in 2008, and it didn't need to be just her. If she did run, and I wrote this publicly, if she did run, I wanted other women to be running against her. I didn't want it to be just her out there. I wanted to see Democratic women challenge her. I wanted Elizabeth Warren to run. I wanted Kirsten Gillibrand to run. Hell, I wish Barbara Lee, who's like my favorite politician, the congresswoman from California, would have run. Like, I wanted to see it not just be Hillary out there, because I think that the weight of her as representative was too heavy.
Well, she wasn't the only one. Carly Fiorina ran for president. She's a woman, last I checked.
Right,
so,
but I needed to see other people challenging Hillary so that she wasn't the woman on the left. Okay. I really wanted that. And I also just feared that, I had a fight with my editor when I was starting to work at the New Republic in 2014, and I said, I think this might be a bad idea. And I'm not sure I think she should run.
You mean bad for her or bad for women, however you define what women's interests are?
I thought it was gonna end badly. I thought that I couldn't bear it. And again, I think she would have been a terrific president. This was not about my thinking she shouldn't run because she wasn't qualified or because she was bad. It was that I had watched what happened, and I thought versions of it were going to happen again. And everybody had this weird confidence. My dear friend and a young male editor, white, was saying to me, come on, she's so popular. There's the meme now. She's a cool lady now. There's the text from Hillary. Everybody thinks she's cool. We all love her. Because this is the cycle with Hillary forever. Like, she gets humiliated in one way or another, either in the news or by losing something or by being defeated or having her health care plan. And then afterwards, everybody decides she's wonderful. And then we think, oh, she's so popular, it can't happen again. And I was like, no, this is gonna happen again. And it's gonna be bad. And you think we're cool with this now? We're not cool with it.
Okay. Farai, you have so many thoughts. I can't even, almost can't even really steer you now. Do you want to just jump in? Because I know that you've been
I can't steer myself. I'm a driverless car.
But you've been thinking, that's right. But you've been thinking so much about this, about what happened in 2016, why it happened in 2016, what did we miss? But I do have to say, Rebecca, and this is not meant any particular way, when you said end badly, for me as an African American, what in my mind, ending badly means somebody kills you. It doesn't mean you lose an election. So for me in 2008, and I think for many other African Americans, I don't really think it really matters what your politics were, because I certainly heard this from many people who were not Obama supporters. Ending badly in that context meant somebody kills you. And I just wonder, is there something interesting there that we should talk about?
I also thought somebody, are you asking me, do I think somebody was going to kill her?
Yeah, did you think somebody would try to kill her?
2 days before the election, I cried in a grocery store to
Really?
my husband because I was like, she's going to get killed.
Because you felt, really?
And that's something I feared about Barack Obama. Nobody's asked me that question before. I don't think I've ever said it publicly. I was very tired. I was also terrified that somebody was going to kill Barack Obama through his entire presidency. But one of the things that had happened in 2016 with regard to both of them, because it was one of the things that I think doesn't get talked about enough, was this risk that they took in running together. Okay, this is the moment I was most scared, and that was also my favorite moment of 2016, was after Obama's speech at the convention when Hillary came out and they hugged. I was like, that was so thrilling to me, because it was taking such a gamble, right? It was taking such a gamble on like sending a message that like, this is what presidents can look like now. And we're actually gonna rely on the idea that we have an electorate that is willing to elect us. But the fury directed at her and him was physically punishing in a way that it was just building, and the sort of lock her up, which was very often string her up, and you had Republicans talking.
And also Trump that bitch,
that
was beyond.
And the elected officials, local elected officials, saying, I think she should be brought into the town square and shot. They were at the 4th of July parades last year. They were her in a coffin, her in jail. They were, think about how Ben Carson said she was friends with Lucifer. They said the same things about and I was at the Republican convention. I don't know, were you, the Chris Christie night? Where he did the witch hunt, guilty or not guilty, and the crowd surged forward, guilty. It was Hillary Clinton, guilty or not guilty, and it was like it was a fever of like wanting to punish her and kill her, and it was building and building and building, and that fury was so intense that yes, I did think she would be killed. I did.
Yeah. Farai, so many things to unpack here. The first thought, I guess I just wanted to start with 2016. What did we miss? Because I know that you've thought a lot about that.
Yeah, I will piggyback. I mean, I go to some dark places. I obviously realized that Secretary Clinton could have been killed, but I didn't think about it as much as I thought with Barack Obama, and I had a chance to interview him during the Democratic primaries in 2008 and asked him about why he was the presidential candidate who had gotten the earliest Secret Service detail in the campaign cycle, because he was getting so many death threats. And he gave a very polished answer, as he's wont to do. But I do think that both of them had to constantly be aware that their lives were being threatened. I remember a moment, I have a bunch of friends from Montana, one of whom is a public radio reporter I went to Standing Rock with last year, but I saw the Montana delegation at the Republican convention, and there were 3 guys, 2 of them wearing kind of Western gear and one guy wearing just a business suit. And all over this business suit were these vile, misogynistic anti-Hillary pins, like "Life's a bitch, don't vote for one," and the fried chicken meme and all that. You can look it up if you want. And so we were videotaping this, so I thought he was going to ignore the fact that he was plastered in misogyny. But no, he was happy to talk about it. You know, I'm clearly a woman and I'm black and whatever, but he's just like so proud. He's like, look at my butt and I got this here and I was like, yep, yeah, there's going to be a heavy lift. You know, because it's like for every person. So one of the things that I think in general that has been, that I think is a narrative that we must pay attention to, not just in retrospect, but especially moving forward, is that what we call the fringe is a part of the mainstream. You know, so people constantly say, white supremacists are fringe. It's like, no, organized white supremacists who march in robes are on the fringe. But there's white supremacists like Steve Bannon who get employed by the federal government. And what I'm less interested in what we call the fringe than when fringe messages enter the mainstream. So when Steve Bannon uses the word cuck to describe Jared Kushner, to understand that it means specifically a black man cuckolding a white man and the black ram topping the white ewe and all of these connotations. Like there's a whole program.
I have to stop you just right there and to say, do you know for a fact that Steve Bannon used that term to apply to Jared Kushner? It has become a white supremacist slur.
No, but it was reported in a series of articles that were very well sourced. So it could be wrong, but if it's wrong in some very high places. And but also just, you know, this guy Gorka, you know, who's part of the Hungarian Nazi party. I mean, whites, and it's like I have interviewed Klans people face-to-face, members of the Aryan Nation before it was disbanded in a civil lawsuit for essentially murdering people and paying the victims of the families, blah, 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 blah. But I just think that we mistake, one of the most poignant moments of the election for me was I was interviewing a woman in Nevada during the final debate, and she said that people kept saying to her that one reason to vote for Donald Trump was to prevent the dilution of the white race. And she's a white woman, but her husband is of Mexican and black ancestry, and their teenage daughter is obviously mixed. And I was like, so what do you say when someone says that? She was like, well, in a business setting, because she's a mortgage broker, I just suck it up. But if I'm at a party, I'm like, what the F are you talking about? And so that's, to me, what was going on in this country. We were getting all these signals that misogyny and white supremacy were very active, not on the fringes, but in mainstream discussions that people had over barbecue or people had at business meetings, and we chose to ignore that because the media likes to put that stuff in the fringe. It's not on the fringe.
So let me just stop you right there, because I want to dig into this a little bit, because there are those who argue that 2016 represents an epic failure of political journalism. And other people say that isn't true, that actually political journalism was at some of the finest political journalism was produced during 2016, but that the cultural undertows were a wave. In essence, this was not a problem of journalism. This is an issue of the culture, and that we just have to fight it out. And so what do you think about that? Rebecca, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is a problem of both the culture and the media, and that the media is a reflection of cultural appetites that were very much on view. I mean, that stuff, to point out that it's not fringe, this is what Donald Trump was selling directly at his rallies. And television networks were so eager to cover it that they would cover an empty mic waiting for him to show up. Now, one of the things that we've heard about Hillary Clinton, who it is absolutely true is not a particularly gifted orator, or at least her approach to running for president is very different, than those who have come before her. But there was no coverage of what Hillary Clinton said at her speeches. I mean, this was a person who is out there, and whatever, you may think any number of things about Hillary Clinton, but she was talking policy all day, every day, to her detriment. In fact, she was mocked for talking about policy so much.
Rebecca, I have to argue on this score, and in part, yes, I do work at NPR, where policy is our bread and butter, and we had, countless minutes of coverage of specific policies, and all the major papers, countless column inches of print on policy. So I just cannot say that I think that's true. And let me just clarify for my own sake as a journalist. It is not for me to say that the outcome of 2016 is an error. That is not my role. But merely to say that many people do not feel they were served by the media because they don't feel they understood the forces that contributed to the outcome. So can we just establish that? That's my baseline. Okay, coming to you, I'll get there. And well,
Can I
folks
just
want to
also
start. Yes, you
clarify
certainly
that in
may. And
particular-
where's the mic going to be? Just so I know, because I'm sensing this is where people are going to. Where's it going to be? Can I see? Oh, okay. Well, why don't we do that? Because people are going to. Yeah, let's do that. Because people are going to want to start getting in it. So,
I just
let's
want to
do it.
clarify in response to what you just
Sure.
said that my particular observation was about the networks that were were
Sure.
doing the empty mics. NPR was also not covering Donald Trump's empty mic
No.
at a rally. So I was actually speaking about that specifically about the television networks that were spending all this time showing every Trump speech in full. That kind of coverage, the coverage of what Clinton was saying, was nowhere near. So yes, it is absolutely fair to point out that there were media outlets that were covering policy. There were people who were writing about policy. But when it came to the kind of television coverage that Donald Trump was thriving on, that is not something that I don't think that there was any.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, Donald Trump got roughly, 1.5 times as much, television airtime for speeches as Clinton did, and I have a whole theory which I'm actually going through and researching with some social researchers. So first of all,
do you feel comfortable sharing your
Yeah,
theory,
that's
even though you're in the middle of your?
I'm gonna do it in a
Well, you're in
very-
the middle of your research, but still, if you feel comfortable,
Yeah,
we'd
but I'm
love to
going to
hear
do it in a very compressed way. So Donald Trump, you think about, first of all, advertising. Advertising must work because people pay all this money for it. Donald Trump was essentially given, and we know because of his airtime, he was given essentially free advertising for his messaging. It's one thing to have him say something xenophobic or misogynistic, and then the analyst comes on and says, well, actually, that's not true, or this or that. But he was just wall to wall. So he was essentially given free advertising. There's a lot of people who've documented the dollar value of it and the time value of it. And a lot of interesting things happen when you give someone a platform who's using both veiled and overt xenophobia. First of all, overt xenophobia changes norms. It's like, well, I didn't used to be able to say the N-word, but now I can, and I feel so relieved. That is not a made-up example. That's something that a real voter actually said, not someone who I interviewed. It's just a sense of relief that the norms are going back to the good old days. Secondly, what you have are some very interesting phenomena where the way that I've come, and this bears more research, but I talked to social scientists again about this, that the way that I think about the xenophobic messaging is essentially, if you think about xenophobia broadly and misogyny as the herpes simplex virus in our culture. Sometimes it's dormant, sometimes you get a cold sore, and sometimes you've got shingles and you can't get out of bed. So we went from dormant to shingles over the course of the election. It's not that there was never any misogyny or racism, but that we gotten it to semi-dormant, maybe a big cold sore level, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa. And then third, this is really fascinating to me. I just talked to this researcher named Paviel Haynes, who's at Princeton, who says that when you test purely patriotic messages coming from politicians, when specifically Republican politicians use xenophobia neutral things like, God bless America, it actually activates xenophobia because people associate these value neutral patriotic statements with God bless America for white people and nobody else. That has nothing to do with the value of the statement, but what it has to do with how many times it's been used as a referential code. So there was the obvious level that Donald Trump was given free time to advertise xenophobia and misogyny, and then there's all these other layers of how the human brain works. And then there's Les Moonves of CBS basically saying how happy he was Donald Trump was making him money. So it's not hard to put this all together and say that the television media ran Donald Trump wall to wall to make money, and meanwhile, it seems likely that that activated latent xenophobia and misogyny. And I think we will put all this together and we will not be happy with the media. NPR is separate, but all the people watching cable news, network news, that's a very powerful cohort.
Do you see the outcome of the 2016 as a failure of journalism in this country?
It's a mixed bag, but yeah. I mean, when you have yes, there were very large elements. I mean, when you look up Les Moonves's statements from those 2 earning calls, where he basically just admits that he was running Donald Trump wall to wall to make money, that has nothing to do with journalistic values, and that's just one level of it. There were a lot of places, like I said, there's this whole idea that when you analyze race and class, that white people have class but not race, and people of color have race but not class, and that's all bullshit. If I can be so, and I did a lot of data analytics and interviewing, and I think that our race, class, generational understanding, and of course our gender understanding of America is so pitiful compared to what it could be. So when I talk to white suburban women, are what I call the swing vote within the swing vote. They've constantly gone back and forth between going for the Republican presidential candidate and the Democratic presidential candidate. And I happened to speak to a woman who I think represented a lot of reluctant Trump voters, where she literally called Donald Trump crazy and still voted for him. And to really get to she hated Hillary Clinton. And then when you get to the why did she hate Hillary Clinton, that's where I think misogyny comes in. But how, can I get her to really say, like I tried asking a lot of ways. I don't trust her, I don't whatever, but how do you get to these code words for, I just don't trust her because she's a woman? Because I think that was a lot of it among women too.
Before Rebecca, I want you to, you've made the study of women and their electoral participation one of the subjects of your career. So you tell me, and please do, I don't want to make this a fitness contest, but please do, if you would, go to the mic if you want to participate in our conversation. And I can't, if you can't get to the mic, then I'll try to come to you. But, sir, and I saw this, where was the lady who wanted to talk earlier? Did she have to go? Well, you were right there. Go ahead. Well, yeah, please. Yeah, please, head to the mic.
I can speak very loud.
No, that's okay. Go ahead. And others, please feel free. We won't think it rude if you want to jump up.
So I have 2 questions. One is I was so floored when I heard that the majority of white women, I think it was white women.
It was white women.
Women had voted for Trump, and if people want to talk about that, I mean, it just like went in the face of people of rational thinking of how did that happen. So that was one question that I had for the panel, and I hope that you'll also include yourself in this talk. Your opinions. I'd like to hear from you as well. No, we don't get to hear from you.
NPR would not.
Oh, I see. And my other thing about journalism is that what was upsetting to me is that the journalists did not challenge all the lies that were said. And when Trump was speaking, or all his people were speaking, that they didn't challenge any of these things.
It was a very.
Do you want to take your seat and listen to the answer?
So first of all,
and come on up, and then I think we all want to hear about, because Rebecca. It's interestingly enough, I was going to go there next. That was actually going to be my question to Rebecca, which is, oh, by the way,
as
a majority of white.
The problem demographic.
No, you are not. No, it's because this is the subject of your reporting. Let me be clear. It is not. This is not. I resist this notion that demography is destiny. This is the subject of your reporting. So on that basis.
So on the question about the white women, I actually, this has been a very useful period because there's been so much coverage of the 53% of white women. One of the things that's interesting about it is that it is the least surprising result from 2016 because white women vote for Republicans. In fact, 56% of them voted for Mitt Romney in 2012. There's actually a small improvement amongst white women voting for Hillary Clinton. But it never gets quite as much attention as it has this time. It's really important that it's getting this attention. I think that we were talking earlier, there are some problematic things about the way it's getting attention. For example, the coverage of how people voted and how they feel post-election, I would say the overwhelming trend has been 50 million stories about our national failure to better empathize with white men. And a lot of stories rightly pointing out the failure of white women to vote for Hillary Clinton. And it's been very interesting because given that it's white people who elected Donald Trump, it's interesting that the fault lies with everybody for not better understanding, channeling, and sympathizing with white men, and the fault lies with white women for not being better.
It's just like original sin when I went to church. Just get on board.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, and the original sin thing also, by the way, I've thought a lot about with regard to Hillary Clinton. Actually, I wrote a column about the untrustworthiness and the way that it stuck to her, which Farai was just talking about. And Salamisha Tillett, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, said to me this, and I hadn't thought of it. She's like, it's biblical. She's like, it flies in the face of reason. There actually have been all kinds of, PolitiFact would always rate her as very honest. Jill Abramson, who was the editor of the New York Times for a long time, wrote a piece in The Guardian about all the investigations that she'd done at the New York Times, that she'd headed up into suspicions that Hillary Clinton had done something nefarious, and that each time it turned up that in fact she hadn't, and that she was an unusually trustworthy politician. And yet this thing about not trusting her stuck and stuck and stuck and stuck. And Salamisha said to me that this is Eve. This is like, this goes back to
or the Russians, maybe.
Oh, right, and the Russians. I mean, well, no, but also, yeah, sure, but the Russians didn't, the stuff about Hillary Clinton being untrustworthy predates Russian interference in the 2016 election by several decades.
Tell me what you mean. Can you, because now, biblical, see, now you're in my territory.
Right.
So when you say that it's biblical, what do you mean by that?
Well, it's definitely not my territory. So I think that when Salamisha said it to me, she said it's the attachment, the presumption of dishonesty attached to
deceitfulness. So in another way, you could say it's cultural. It really goes beyond the facts.
Let me pile on to the biblical, because I did all
you.
these demographic profiles, and one of them was of white evangelical Christians, and a woman who studies politics and religion also essentially said that it was biblical or religious, that there was, that she believed, and I can't remember her name, but the analyst who I quoted basically believed that if Clinton were a man, she wouldn't have had so many problems with white evangelical Christians and with many other demographics who were firmly against her. And I just want to say very briefly to the other point that the person just made, is that the fact-checking was inconsistent, both across media forms. You heard more on NPR, you saw more in the New York Times, but I think that there was also another dynamic that was very flawed in the media, which was initially Donald Trump was poo-pooed and treated as a celebrity, which is what I call the free lunch phase. Then there was an analytical phase where it's like, oh, he's for real, let's dive in. And then there was the hate on him phase, where it was like, oh my God, this guy's gonna destroy democracy. So if you're a Trump voter, and you definitely have a right, I don't know that there are any in this room, but you know, I support everyone's right to vote. So if you were a Trump voter, you went from being told that the person who you supported was a clown, to being told that he had some fact-checking problems, to being told he was the devil. That's bad journalism. The whole framing of that is bad, and it hurt the credibility of the media.
Okay. Can I add one quick?
You certainly can, but I want to not forget our folks who I invited in. So go ahead.
I just want to add to the journalistic habits thing that one of the things I've heard a lot in retrospect is we challenge them equally. This seemed to be a standard at many newspapers. We challenged Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump equally. I think we ran an equal number of stories about them. And I think about that all the time, and I think about, we hold that up to be the journalistic standard, that we're gonna, that we're gonna delve with equal frequency and intensity into their records and their past. In this case, that sense of self-justification by saying, oh, we did it equally, it weighed out, is out of bounds from reality, because what you were dealing with was two entirely different kinds of people. And by all means, challenge Hillary Clinton and her record and whatever. But the notion that this person who's had a multi-decade record in the public eye, who's been multiply investigated by multiple news organizations for years and years, who has been a politician for years and years, that there wasn't a larger need to investigate someone who is entirely new to politics, who had not been under that kind of scrutiny.
Okay, but now that's two contradictory ideas, which is that on the one hand, that is one of the other arguments that people will make. It's that part of the reason that Donald Trump got so much more so much more attention is that he was new to the political scene, and therefore his record required more scrutiny.
But there's a difference between giving him a chance to talk and say whatever he wants to do and actually delving into his past and his record.
Fair point. Let's go to our folks.
Brendan Keating from the Youth Political Participation Program over at Eagleton. I'm also a proud member of the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. So I have a long question, but answer some of it, all of it, whatever fits you, and so we can still get to everybody else. Is there a difference between news curation and censorship? Is it possible to reverse what happened last year when we see that clicks and circus rallies pay the bills better than educating the public? Can we ever go back to a point where we can see regulation is not a bad word and use the news to educate the public in a way that's not so much entertainment? And is there a point to talking about whether over-editorializing everything is better than getting back to who, what, where, when, and why? Thanks.
Yeah, I think that what you're talking about are what are the norms of journalism, and how do the dynamics of a tech-driven news consumption environment affect journalism. So what are the norms of journalism? I think that they're being reconstituted right now, and some of what you talk about gets into things that are very much in the control of private industry, like algorithms. So Google just changed its algorithm to try to deprioritize the surfacing of fake news. Facebook hired Campbell Brown, the former CNN anchor, to work on understanding how Facebook's business model, which largely relies on having you see both what you like to see and advertising, is or isn't compatible with journalism, which tries at least to surface things that you don't want to read, but you need to know. And so I like your questions. I think that the answer is that America has never been particularly good at having a regulatory environment that favors the news media, down to our public media funding. President Johnson had the chance to use a television tax to fund robust public media. He chose not to do it. But right now, essentially, the media ecosystem is largely driven by algorithms at major companies. And one thing to look at is there was a piece in the New York Times arguing that Google and Facebook are now the equivalent of public utilities and need to be broken up because they're monopolies. So there's all these, I can't get into all of it, but you raise a lot of questions that are important. And I think that the big pipes that are private, Google and Facebook, are facing a lot of pressure to change, but their revenue models rely on a lot of filter bubble stuff and ad serving.
Please.
Hi, my name is Morgan. I'm a student here at Rutgers University in the gender and media minor. My professor put me up to this.
Go.
You mentioned some time before about how the media has recently brought up issues about gender, race, and class. And coincidentally, I took a class last semester with my professor called Gender, Race, and Class in the Media. And so it's definitely an important topic to talk about now. And I remember in the class we talked about, to an extent, all of the things we're talking about today. And what we did in the class was, we watched a lot of Spike Lee. And there's no doubt that his films are definitely socially conscious. But we also looked at political journalism articles of today and things like the Time magazine cover of Donald Trump and Chris Christie and how those images are affecting us today. And I think she wanted you all aware of that this class exists. And it's a great class, and it was really informative and helpful to people like me who didn't really notice politics in journalism. I'm an English major, not a journalism major. So
I was an English major. I think you were an English major. It's not too late.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
I love meeting other English majors because people put us down too much. But I do have a question for you. Given that I'm a student, and because of the minor, I am taking more journalism classes now. But I remember, Rebecca, you said that journalism you thought was such like an esteemed and awesome major to be studying. I'm kind of sorry to say, but I don't think that it's
She meant back in the day.
back in the day, but I don't think it's the same
Anyway, I'm
anymore.
sorry, go ahead.
And I think that's sad because journalism is definitely an important thing to go, an important career to go into. It's what gives us free speech, and it's so important to our democracy. But people aren't pursuing it anymore because of this schlump of fake news and lack of reputability. And I want to ask you, what can students who are studying journalism now, what can we do to get us out of this schlump, to bring journalism's reputation back to what it was, being fact and research based, not biasedly opinion based?
I think that journalism, and again, this speaks to sort of what the previous speaker said, journalism is an ecosystem, it's not an organism. So, in an ecosystem, you have the bottom feeders, you have the predators, you have the innocent little plants that just have not much of a lifespan, the mayflies, the whatever. I mean, I'm going on and on, but you get my point. There are good-hearted, good-minded, smart people in journalism, and they're really smart, really evil people in journalism, a couple of whom just got fired from Fox News. But
there's so many things. But I actually did want to talk about Fox for a minute here because I just found it such an interesting story. One of the questions I had is, does it mean anything? Do the recent events involving Fox News mean anything? Because these are the various data points. So yes, Roger Ailes got fired, Bill O'Reilly got fired, but Fox also paid them tens of millions of dollars to go away. And they also knew what the rest of us did not know for certain, that these practices persisted for years, and also the fact that one of the people who has now been elevated to fill that position is a person who recently made a comment about how much he liked seeing how the president's daughter was talking into a microphone, and just a few months before that went to Chinatown in New York and made a
super racist Orientalism video,
basically mocking people, invoking every sort of stereotype, and this person has now been promoted to take. So the question, so what is the significance of what just happened?
Well, it's significant, but as you point out, I mean, Melissa Harris Perry, I've been doing a research project at Harvard on race, gender, and the political press corps. First of all, most companies, including Fox, didn't disclose their statistics to me. But Melissa Harris Perry was like, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, she was like, anytime people say, why should there be more diversity, that presumes there has to be a reason. You're sitting in my chair. Like, if you can be mediocre, I can be mediocre too in that chair, and you're just taking the chair. But aside from that, usually you find that women and African Americans and Asian Americans and Latinos and Native Americans have to bring something extra to get in the door. But that should not be a prerequisite. But what you see is these guys failing up. This guy who did this, horrible anti-Asian video and made these inappropriate comments, he's failed up because some other people have moved on, like O'Reilly. And O'Reilly gets to drop out with this huge golden parachute, which is more than enough to fund a new women's newspaper.
Okay, but what is this? What's the meaning of this?
So what I'm saying is the meaning is that every time there is a sort of outing, a major outing of gender or race, there is a realignment of power. So does that mean that we have ended sexism in that newsroom, or does it mean that it's gone deeper underground, or does it mean that people are just giving sexism a break and they're going to go back to it? We don't know yet, but we do know that there's been a realignment where certain types of sexually aggressive and just plain aggressive, because you have to remember there was bullying that wasn't even sexualized, and there was a woman producer who worked for O'Reilly who now has PTSD. She got a payment, and she has suffered mental health damages and never gone back into the profession. So I think all of that has posed a certain realignment, but we won't know for a while exactly how that realignment is. And what I'll say just briefly is there's 2 class action lawsuits proceeding for racial discrimination against both CNN and Fox. And the CNN one is actually bigger and doesn't involve on-air talent, but involves behind the scenes. And so when you open the crypt of race and gender in the media, there's a lot of things rotting in there.
Rebecca?
I also think, and this is something that I argue all the time, we are in the midst of an epic battle about who gets to have power in this country. And this country is built on a presumption, literally economically built, politically built on white male power. And the assumption that white men get to keep that power and abuse it in all kinds of directions and not have to pay for it. So I would argue that the fact that we are living in a period in which all kinds of things are in some big ticket ways being reorganized, power structure, that we've had 2 administrations of a black president, that we had a woman who came very close to being the president, that we live in a country now where Bill O'Reilly and Roger Ailes can be forced to step down, albeit like 30 years later and with millions of dollars as their parting gift, but where you can lose your job for abusing your power is also part of the story of why Donald Trump is our president, because he comes to power on a wave of people who are furious that you don't just get to keep your power in your old, that white men's grip on power is being challenged, right? So these things are all, does it mean anything definitive? No, it's another sign of the fact that we are in a period of extremely intense struggle over the direction the country's going in and who gets to have a seat at the table, or whatever metaphor you want to use. And Donald Trump he wasn't just magicked into the White House, right? He rode in there on the open resentments and backlash to the sense that we might be reorganizing who can have power in this country.
Go ahead. You can go ahead. Sir.
Hi. My name is Jaydev. I'm a freshman, and first of all, thank you for coming. I sign up for all these events on the newsletters we get, and when they're awesome events, that just makes me like Rutgers a lot more. But
we are happy to serve.
So I had 2 questions. The first is, actually during Rutgers' 250th birthday, there was an event about media going forward, right? And at that event, there were executives from, I think, Fox, CBS, and NBC. Yeah, and they received a question saying, why did you give Trump so much airtime? Because I know you guys mentioned that. And why did you give him a platform greater than those of other people to espouse his views and get in people's heads maybe, right? And I wrote down their response. So they said that there's this common idea that Trump played the news channels and turned them into reality TV. According to them, it's their responsibility to cover them the way they did, to cover him the way they did. They said Donald Trump called in and other candidates played a safer game not calling in as much. And the things he said, being provocative, they demanded coverage because we have to cover provocative things. And he essentially made himself accessible, which people didn't realize, and instead they complained that he got coverage. He branded himself well. He didn't really use a ground game like other candidates, but he took advantage of the dynamic of getting airtime. And so they said they didn't cover him differently, which I know you mentioned. So how would you respond to that?
I'm just going to say that's very helpful, and I'm appreciative that you took notes. And I want to mention that we have internships at NPR.
I know.
I will
That's right.
talk to you after
For
the event.
people who take good notes. So I just want to throw that out there. But how can we help you with that question? Okay.
I mean, I think that, yeah. Well, I just think that a lot of that is self-serving BS. And if there was still an equal time clause in media, this would not have played out the way that it did. But to say that he marketed himself well, it's like, well, if someone's selling a vacuum cleaner and I have wood floors, just because you're marketing that vacuum cleaner well doesn't mean I have to buy it. The news executives did not have to put him on wall to wall. There was no news imperative whatsoever. And when I say news executives, we're again talking in this television framework.
Right.
And people like Jeb Bush, who, whether you liked him or didn't like him, had actual policy positions. He had probably as many as Secretary Clinton. But Jeb Bush couldn't get arrested in a mall for stealing a Cinnabon, you know? And I just don't see how that's good journalism.
And I would say that I agree that it is self-justifying BS, except, and I do agree with that, I would say that it dovetails with one of my most serious criticisms of how the Hillary Clinton campaign was run, though. And I do think that she made real errors with the press, and I think they're because she did not make herself available to the press.
Right.
She was incredibly distant from the press. She did not call into the shows. She did not go on the shows. And I think that this was a mistake that probably is not totally unrelated to conversations about how we perceive powerful women, and the fact that she had this reputation as somehow being unlikable, untrustworthy, and toxic, and because she felt, and I think that there are arguments about this, that the press was not going to give her a fair shake, and she made herself scarce. And I think that was an error, because if you look at how the numbers actually went, it is simply not true. And you will hear from people, Hillary was regarded as toxic, nobody wanted to put her in her own ads, people don't like Hillary Clinton. The opposite is the case. When she made herself available, or was made available, when she sat for 11 hours in Benghazi hearings, and you saw her doing her job with her stack of papers and answering competently, her numbers took a huge spike. After every debate, her numbers spiked. When she actually sat with reporters, and I had this experience, she talked to very few reporters, and she let me in for like a 40-minute interview, and I wrote a profile of her the main accomplishment was that it revealed her to be a carbon-based life form, like an actual human being. And people, I still have people come to me today like, oh my God, Hillary was so great. It's because she let me talk to her. Yeah. But that
was an amazing piece.
But but there were others. Ezra Klein, the few journalists who she permitted in to speak to her and let herself talk, they wound up coming away being like, hey, she's human, she's interesting, she has things to say.
But
and
that
she
leads to
didn't
the
do that
question
enough.
is that, candidates are the blue plate special. You can't pick the side dish, you get what you get, and you don't get upset. Maybe this goes back to the very beginning of our evening tonight, maybe she was just the wrong candidate who ran a bad campaign.
Yeah, sure, that's possible.
I think there were bad elements of her campaign, but it was not in what we're talking about here in the media coverage. Like I spend a lot of time in.
Well, let me just say, both things can be true. She can be a bad candidate who ran a bad campaign.
No,
she
was not a bad candidate, but I think that elements of her ground game were bad. But that's unrelated to how the press covered her, because you're talking about more airtime. But specifically, I heard and saw that some of her field offices were not reaching their intended targets well. Right. So when I went to white working class communities in Ohio, the narrative that we're better off now than we were 8 years ago, technically true, emotionally completely not selling. Like when you talk to people where the car factory has shut down, the steel mill has shut down, there's abandoned houses, and you tell them that life is better than it was 8 years ago, even if that's true for the majority of the country, and basically what had happened is that in 10 years, you had seen the Great Recession decimate income, which just came back to its previous decade level in an inflation-adjusted terms. So people were not feeling in any way secure, and I think there was too much of a presumption that people were feeling secure. And then also I saw things like there was this pace of relentless digitization of materials, and a lot of volunteers in political campaigns are young, but some are also quite elderly. And I saw people who were not just retirees, but kind of super seniors, where like the campaign offices were sent all these materials for iPad, and people literally had to type them out and give them to people who were not, who were great volunteers, but not going to be using an iPad. But that's a completely different conversation than what we've been talking about. To be clear, I think there were some structural problems with the ground game, but that's very different from the TV coverage.
I just want to be clear on where we are on time, and I just want to see if we can have an opportunity to get to as many questions and ideas as we can. I probably should have started our conversation with like the minister when my husband and I got married, said, you know what you should do? You should just start every morning by saying, I'm sorry. That way you're covered for the rest of the day. And I should have just started by saying, I'm sorry, but we'll do the best we can, okay? And Rebecca, maybe you can just, go ahead, finish it. You know what I'm saying?
Well, no, I
I
did want to say that I think it can be true that you can critique very fairly lots of things about Hillary Clinton's candidacy, and can say that there were errors made. But that doesn't mean she was a terrible candidate.
Exactly.
She was, by many measures, a terrific candidate. I mean, if you, and it depends on what you look at and how you look at it and where you're coming from, obviously, and you're going to have different evaluations of her. But I don't think there's any, I think we comfort ourselves sometimes by telling ourselves, oh, she was just a terrible candidate. It wasn't about us. It wasn't about these other things. She was just terrible. But that's not why I didn't want her to run. I didn't want her to run for other reasons. But I think it's too easy to just say, oh, she was a bad candidate, because that's a way to not have the harder conversations about what we did. All of us, not just the media, not all of us, everybody.
Okay.
Hello, I'm Fatima Han, and I'm a junior. I study history, and I minor in Africana, and my question is kind of going to dip into the previous question because it runs along kind of like a similar vein, but I remember...
May I offer a bit of big sister advice?
Yeah.
Never apologize for your questions.
All right, thank you. I appreciate it. But my question, I think, is primarily focused on your comment before, when you were talking about, the journalism and how it progressed, and originally it started off as taking Donald Trump as a joke, which comes as a surprise to me only because we know fundamentally that this country is built on white supremacy, and I'm talking about specifically how it benefits whiteness for both women and for men. So in that vein, I guess, what are the criticisms that you have for your field in that regard? Why was it considered a joke in that aspect? And also, when he did, when he did have this platform and we were talking about equal air, was this, I don't understand journalism that well, obviously I'm a history major, but was this for money, for views? What was it for, what was it intended for? And another thing, a side note, I think, Rebecca, you mentioned honest policies for Hillary Clinton, or honest politics. I just want to say, we know that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump, and I thought it was very surprising when you mentioned that 56 originally voted for Mitt Romney. But my question is, and let me look back on my notes, black women overwhelmingly voted for Hillary Clinton regardless of the fact that she was involved in the war on drugs. And that was brought up, I think, throughout her candidacy, as well as her flipping the script sometimes. And another thing, I just want to throw in Bernie Sanders into that,
Okay, but
equation.
now I'm going to ask you to bring it home for us.
An overall question for you both.
Yeah, I mean, quickly, what I'll say is that I, in addition to women being blamed for, for those who are in the mood of blame, because I just want to acknowledge that, I have very clear politics, but I also have always interviewed everyone, and I treat them fairly and respectfully. And the series I did is called The Voters. It's 538.com/thevoters. And I profiled all sorts of different demographics, many of them Trump voters, many of them Clinton voters, some of them independent voters. And there were a lot of people who voted for Sanders in the primary and who didn't vote for Clinton or Trump. They either voted for a third party or they didn't vote. And I think that we have to analyze what the unmet needs were. I mean, I certainly have my critiques of, I'm very much in the strategic voting camp. Like, I don't believe voting third party is a bad idea if you're in a safe district. However, in a two-party democracy, if you actually want to prevent crazy people from getting into office, you should probably play the two-party game because it's the only game that gets played. That's my own structural analysis. But I also don't believe that you can blame black voter turnout for going down, as some people actually have. They were like, well, why didn't black people super vote the way that they did before? It's like, because they weren't as super excited, maybe, and I think that we've answered some of these questions previously, but I do think that I do think that part of the framing of Donald Trump initially as a joke, as sort of like both a celebrity and a joke, was because we misunderstood the power of xenophobic messaging. There is a photograph of a rally, and I'm not making, please don't take this as a false equivalency. I'm not saying that Donald Trump is a Nazi. I'm making a broad comparison that in America, there was a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. And this was tolerated because there were a strain of Americans who believed in the Nazi Party before World War II started. So that was part of the American mainstream. You can't say it was underground if it was at Madison Square Garden. What I'm saying is that we constantly say things are on the fringes that are part of the mainstream, and people mistook his xenophobia for fringe when it was permeating the mainstream.
Can I just offer another perspective on this, because I have worked in these newsrooms for a long time and was once asked to cover Donald Trump as a candidate, and part of the reason that I don't think people took him seriously as a candidate is because he'd been talking about running for so long, literally for a decade, that people just thought that's just another, he's bored and he's made enough money for today and he's going to, you see what I'm saying? I think that's just, honestly, I can just tell you from an assignment editor standpoint, it was in part because he'd been talking about it for so long. Like I had a long conversation with Maureen Dowd about this when I was filling in for Diane Rehm, for example. And, shout out to Diane Rehm, one of our great, figures who recently she's a podcast if you're interested in. One of the conversations I had with Maureen Dowd is that, you acted like this was a joke. And she said, I regret that now because I did think it was a joke. I thought it was just kind of another whim, because she has known him and interviewed him many, many times as kind of part of the New York social scene. So that would be just my brief perspective on that. Can we, go ahead, Rebecca, you wanted to add to that? Or?
Well, I just wanted to say that in terms of why the white supremacy that was the core of Trump's message was treated as a joke it also has to do with the fact that in this country we want to do anything more than actually talk seriously about the way in which our power structures have been built on white supremacy, on white patriarchy. And that's just the conversation we never want to have. We always want to have a feel-good conversation about all the progress we've made, and we never actually want to talk about the ways that race and gender still define who gets to have power, who gets to have a voice. The other point that I would make is I have zero interest in defending Hillary Clinton on Super Predator or on her retroactive support of welfare reform. However, I do want to make an observation next to that, which is that I am extremely critical of the policy that was passed in the 1990s around welfare reform, around the crime bill. But I also have noticed that the men who passed it, who were in office, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, who wrote that crime bill, Bernie Sanders, who voted for it, have never been handed the bill for it. And the person who got handed the check was the woman who did not hold office, and who in that era, and I don't want to defend it, I don't want to defend her use of the word super predator, and I do not want to defend the way that retroactively she claimed to have gathered support for welfare reform. But what I do want to point out, there's not a defense of that, but what I do want to point out is that in the era where she was the wife, she was a wildly controversial wife, in part because she was seen as the left wing, pretty inaccurately, as the left wing pull on her husband's centrist moves. And there was tremendous pressure on her to support and back up these moves that he was making. And that does not excuse the fact that she did it by any stretch. But it is very interesting to me that these guys have skated to popularity, beloved popularity, Uncle Joe, Bernie, Bill, right? And that the person who got stuck with the check for all their crap policy in the 90s is the woman who didn't actually have an active role or elected office when it was passed.
She's preaching though.
Yeah.
She says it's not her area, but she's preaching. Just saying.
Amen.
Professor.
Yeah. Abena Busia, Chair of Women's and Gender Studies, born in Ghana, raised in Europe, which is relevant to the question I'm about to ask. Because I have been in this country 35 years, and there are moments when I remember that I'm an alien. And I'm about to talk about one of them, was Donald Trump coming to make the declaration that he wanted to run for president. I am too an English professor and a poet. Symbolic moments matter. So here you have somebody coming down, we all know that image of him coming down the escalator at Trump Tower, to make what is in most people's careers a really important moment, making a symbolic statement. And what comes out of his mouth is all Mexicans are rapists. I know of no other country in which you could say that and your candidacy survive. I grew up in England, where there was a politician equally as racist and everything else. Enoch Powell, who had had a long career of being a right-wing fascist, one day stood up and made a speech, an immigration speech about rivers of blood. It destroyed his political career. He had to go back to the little dusty village where he'd grown up, because there are some places where it is recognized certain things cannot be part of the public discourse because of what they unleash. But it is precisely what it unleashed that made this man president. I don't get it. But what made me stand up was when you said, okay, let us judge people on what they have done. We are told that Donald Trump is a successful businessman, although from what I can gather, his success was the genius idea of selling his name. I wish I could sell Busia and put it on a 30-hour tower and make myself rich. But I want to know, why then did his business practices get as little scrutiny as they did? Who among us can have multiple bankruptcies and be considered successful? Who among us can run businesses where we would rather declare bankruptcy and shift the people who work for us, leave them in penury carrying the can, and still be considered successful? By what ethical standard is he being judged that we've been told this is the measure of success?
Okay, let me go there. Thank you. So first of all, I
before
think
you finish, let me just say this. If you're in line now, we will try to get to you, but this is the best we can do, okay? And then sorry. Go for it.
Yeah, so I think that your last phrase, by what ethical standard, is the key one. He was not judged by an ethical standard. He was judged by an aspirational standard, which is why people bought into Trump University. And you'll remember that he paid a $25 million settlement after the election, I believe, for educational fraud. He's paid settlements where he doesn't have to admit wrongdoing for racial discrimination in housing and educational fraud. But people in this country, we have a cult of success in America. And sometimes people are willing to, it's kind of like the Cagney gangster myth, but even more weird than that. It's like, success is success, even if you have to rob a bank to get it. And I do think that there's some people who just bought into the gold toilet myth, regardless of what it was built on and whose dollars did it. And you remember that he didn't disclose his tax returns, so we don't know whether or not, there was one that was leaked, but we don't know whether or not he's actually a billionaire. There's now something that we should keep our eyes on, which is that there are all these condos he owns that are being bought and sold through, essentially shadow corporations. So you don't know if someone's trying to do influence peddling with the Trump administration and buying a $500,000 condo for $5 million. And there's an ongoing investigation into how his condo sales, Trump condo sales are being run often through these very veiled corporations. So a lot of this has to do with the legal structures of how money is made and under what circumstances you can declare bankruptcy. As most of us in this fine educational institution know, that you can't discharge educational debt in a bankruptcy. So there are literally people whose Social Security checks are being garnished because they owe educational debt, but Donald Trump has been able to discharge, these millions of dollars in corporate debt. So ethics has nothing to do with it, my friend.
Good evening. Thank you for your words. So my name's Azra Beg. I'm a school board member. I was a leader of the New Jersey Women's March, and I was a panelist for the Center for American Women in Politics, where we saw a great output of support with so many women coming out for the Ready to Run conference. I have a simple question. Is America ready for a female president in 2020?
Rebecca, the question has your name on it.
Okay, I hope so. I mean, and I'm very public about my political leanings. My fear often is that the first female president will be somebody whose politics I abhor. Yeah. I think President Nikki Haley is a very real possibility down the road. I would not be happy about that. Here's what I do think.
Can I just ask you, why do you think that is, though? Why do you think that is? It's more likely that the first female president will be...
Before Hillary, if you'd asked me in, 1998, who's going to be the first woman president, I would have said
Elizabeth Dole.
Yeah, Elizabeth Dole, exactly. Because fulfills all kinds of, proximal power. By the way, it's not an accident that the person to come closest first was the wife of a former president. Elizabeth Dole was another example. That's how women have always gotten first into politics, is proximal power, the widow's mandate. But also, it's much more comfortable to elect a woman who supports policy that supports white male power, which is, of course, what conservative policy does by many measures, by my lights anyway. And so it's more comfortable to have the figure who can be symbolically diverse, but who in fact would support the existing power structure. Now, here's what I will be optimistic about. One of the things, and the people from COP can correct me on this is something that Barbara Lee from the Barbara Lee Family Foundation has talked to me about for years, that on state levels, when it comes to electing governors, the hardest thing is to elect the first woman. And that once you begin to adjust your eyes and ears and to electing women, it gets easier to elect more. And that's why you see some states that actually have pretty robust histories of electing women. And often they're, by the way, Western and frontier states, which is a whole other interesting thing. But Texas, Alaska, California, even Maine, it's often the places that are not the bastions of blue politics, where women have a longer history of success and where women also could vote first. There's a whole complicated history there. But one of the things that I do believe Hillary Clinton has done in both these campaigns is done a lot of the work of having been the first woman president, sadly without ever having done the job, which again, I think she would have been really good at. I think she's done a lot of the heavy lifting, really heavy lifting, of adjusting our eyes and ears. That does not mean it's going to be easy. It does not mean that there will be all kinds of new waves. I mean, you can feel it already as sort of directed at Elizabeth Warren as she goes back onto a campaign trail in Massachusetts. It's not going to be easy, and I'm not sure we could do it in 2020. But I also don't think, this is a real question about, does that mean that you shouldn't try? No. I hope that there are a lot of women who run in both parties, in 2020. And I think I remain optimistic that this essentially trauma is actually gonna bring us to a place where we get ready quicker.
But if your priority, Rebecca, and the you is the collective you. If the priority is electing a woman as president, why wouldn't you vote for Nikki Haley if she were a credible candidate?
It's not my priority. No.
Yeah, I don't mean you, but if one, as a voter, if the priority were...
If the priority is representation,
right.
If the priority is fulfilling what our promise is in theory, which is a representative government, then you need more women and people of color on all sides of the aisles, because ideally you want to have people to vote for and vote against enthusiastically who represent the population that they're going to govern. So I will be thrilled if I can vote against Nikki Haley in my life. you know? Because it's not just about we raise a bar real high for women and people of color, right? They've got to be better. This is something that Farai was talking about. You know, they've got to be better than everybody else. And this is Bella Abzug famously said, it's not just about, you know, getting the next female Einstein. It's about ensuring that the female schlemiels can get ahead as fast as the male schlemiels. And that's true in politics too. We can't just have clean, pure, wonderful women who stand for all the best things. Like, we also have to have women that we feel lukewarm about, that we don't like, that we vote against, and that we vote for grudgingly. Like, you know, we need the variety. We actually need to have candidates who represent us. That's theoretically the promise of the United States, and it's never been fulfilled on any level.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, lightning round. We are going to get through this, and then I'm going to ask our panelists to give that last shred of energy and give us a closing thought from each of them. So let's do that.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I graduated from the journalism school in 2013. I just had a quick question. We've talked a lot about, you know, sexism involving Donald Trump to Hillary Clinton, but do you feel like, whether retrospective or at the time, did the media do a good job of acknowledging sexism, racism that went on during the Democratic primaries? We saw a lot of people, I'm going to say mainly Bernie Sanders supporters, saying that Hillary was only in the place that she was because of her husband. We also saw a lot of criticism of, you know, black people that weren't coming out to vote for Bernie. They didn't know what they were doing, they were ignorant, you know. So just wondering, do you feel like the media did a good job of looking at pretty much white liberalism and scrutinizing that during the political process?
No.
Yeah, I would agree on the no. It's because that created, there were so many complex narratives. Well, what I will say is that there are always reporters who, like, I thought the interaction between people like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who came to support Sanders, and some other black journalists who write pieces where they're more first person, who didn't support Sanders and said that he had no race analysis mixed in with his class analysis. That was fascinating to me, but that reached such an elite segment. So I think as with much of this election, there was a lot of great journalism that reached a narrow or elite audience, but not so much broadly.
One of the things that's been fascinating, which I was hoping we'd get into, we don't have time for now, is just what an interesting cultural moment that we are in, where there's a movie like Get Out, for those of you who've seen that, which is a very pungent critique of white liberalism, among other things. And there's an interesting play at the Arena, and right now it's going around the country, by Lydia Diamond, Smart People. Mm-hmm. And it's just very interesting that the culture is offering these critiques, that the artistic world is offering critiques that perhaps the journalistic world is not. That to me is just an interesting point. Thank you. Lightning round, keep going.
Okay, lightning round. Hi, Charlotte Bunch, the founder
Thank you
of the
for
Center
having
for
us.
Women's Global Leadership and professor here. I think it's amazing that we've gone 2 hours without just saying that Hillary Clinton won by 3 million popular votes. And I say that because I think it's really important not to lose that in the narrative of the discussion, but also because I would really like to working internationally, the question I get asked the most is, how could she lose the popular vote? I mean, how could she win the popular vote and lose? Now, we're all used to the Electoral College, but to me, it is one of the pillars of how white male power remains in power. And
it was designed to be.
It was designed to be. So I don't think we can have this conversation over time and not really begin to talk about what we're going to do about the Electoral College. I know a lot of my friends say it's realpolitik, it's there, and we're not going to change it this year. I know that. But I think that we have to be much more critical that we are the only democracy in the world that has a system which prevents the popular vote from prevailing. And that we really have to question, as I'm getting questioned all the time, what do you call democracy in America? You don't have a democratic system, not as we've come to understand it. So I'd be really interested in what you see as the media role in that, but also that to me is something we have to take on, because it is not going to stop being a pillar of controlling the vote in the United States very disproportionately and I grew up in a small rural state, so I know how people are attached to that.
I definitely appreciate what you say, and I think that there's a lot of merit to it. I just don't think it's changeable, and I'd be willing to hear an argument otherwise. One of my friends calls it giving rural people 7/5 of a vote. So it's not just a state-by-state divide, it's also an urban-rural divide, and it was designed that way. But what you would, in order to repeal it, you would have to get all of these states that benefit from the electoral college discrepancies to get on board with dismantling their own power framework. I don't see that happening. And what I would say is democracy is, I'm not a fan of the electoral college, but democracy takes many forms. If you look at the French election, if we had an election that was like the French election, I think that Clinton would have won.
I do too.
Because what if you had Sanders, Clinton, Trump, and Jeb Bush, and a couple other people all running in a primary, like a sort of open primary, and then you had the two face off? I think it would have been a very different race. So what is a democracy? Is a democracy a two-party democracy, a multi-party democracy, a representational democracy? So I would just say that the whole construct of what people consider democracy, we're human beings, we created these constructs, and we can change them, but I don't see an easy way to convince states that benefit from the Electoral College from giving up that advantage.
I'm going to ask if we could keep it going, because I actually have to drive back to Washington tonight. So I do, because I have a show to host this weekend. Actually, I have two. So I'm going to ask if we could continue as quickly as we can.
Hi, my name is Farah, and I'm a student here. I'm a philosophy major and a film major, and I'm here as part of 90.3 The Core FM. So much love to NPR. I listen to it all the time to take notes on what I should do better. I actually have two questions. The first thing is, do you think that this election was actually a good thing in that we're here talking about this now? Because if Hillary had won, a lot of people would be celebrating a victory and forgetting that people like the ones who voted for Trump out of misogyny exist and are part of the society. And the second question that I have is, I am Egyptian personally, and a lot of times I definitely feel that, especially right now, that I'm an alien when I'm outside of Rutgers, because Rutgers is very liberal, very accepting, and very diverse. So for example, here we're all agreeing on a lot of things, but how do we get this conversation to other people who should be listening to this, who have no access or don't want to have access to factual information that would support a less misogynistic America? Thank you.
Well, the only point I want to say, thank you for that. The only point I would want to make is that I would not want it to be said that everybody voted for Trump because they're misogynistic. I think people vote how they vote for all kinds of reasons. And some people voted for the Supreme Court. Yep. And I think that it's interesting that you talked about the fact that the popular vote has not come up tonight, but neither has redistricting and neither has the Supreme Court. And I can tell you that many of the voters that I interviewed throughout the course of the year, unless they were just making stuff up to make me go away, told me that the Supreme Court was a priority for them, and that the strategy of Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, to hold open the seat, to decline to hold a vote, even a hearing, that was for them. It was he made it a referendum on the Supreme Court for some voters, and was successful in that. So that was that's the only point I'd want to make, is that people vote how they vote for all kinds of reasons. And go ahead, Rebecca,
and that was the Supreme Court was going to be key to my answer to your first question, which is it good that this happened because we're having this discussion? And the answer to that is no. It is not good that this happened by any measure. I resist all silver lining, even when people talk about the Women's March and the re-energize. No. There's not a silver lining. We have a Supreme Court that's going to be in place for 50 years, and that's going to determine who can vote. It's going to determine, look, we have coal in the streams. Again, we have ice caps that are melting. The earth is being destroyed. We have, dreamers who are being deported. People are going to suffer for a long time because of what happened. And the fact is, if Hillary Clinton had been elected, first of all, there would still be massive gender and racial backlash that we'd be dealing with. She'd be obstructed every step of the way, but she would have replaced a couple I hope, if they'd let her, replaced a couple of Supreme Court justices, and there's no exchange for this. We can say that it is good that people are paying attention, because it would be a nightmarish disaster if they weren't. But that does not mean that in the end, it all is going to turn out okay. And I think we have to resist telling ourselves that it's all going to turn out okay, because now we all care. We should have cared. We're late to caring.
Hey ladies, my name is Rachel. I am a journalism student here, graduating in May. And I have one question. Is it possible to be an objective journalist in what they would call a post-truth era? And and like secondly, or do journalists have to be like activists today?
Well, first of all, congratulations, home stretch, woohoo! And congratulations, journalism.
And condolences, because now you got to get a job.
Stop. So first of all, I have never been a fan of the word objectivity, so that's going to touch my answer. And there's many different ways. The best definition of objectivity I've read is this idea that objectivity is the process, not the reporter. Very often, I think objectivity is framed as the reporter, meaning, so to be objective, that means you divorce yourself from your race, your gender, your sexual orientation, your class, and you're just floating in a little fluffy cloud like God, and you're looking down on the people. I reject that. What I prefer is thinking of journalism through the lens of fairness, which is that I've interviewed white supremacists and continue to this day. I'm not objective about them. I believe they're morally wrong, but I'm also fair to them, which means that I listen carefully, I understand what they're saying, I don't misrepresent them, I'm not sensationalistic, and I understand that they're human beings. They're not devils, they're just human beings who happen to feel passionately about white supremacy, but by engaging with them, I've learned so much. Like, I've learned that actually it's easier to talk with white supremacists about meritocracy than it is to talk to many people who are considered mainstream, because white supremacists fundamentally don't believe, many of them, not all of them, but many of them don't believe in meritocracy. They believe in might makes right. And they will admit it when you talk to them. It's like, well, we want to rule because we've got the guns and we've got the government. And it, it's like, there's some people who believe that white people are inherently better, but it's actually the ones. I've had a conversation running with this one guy for quite a while now, who basically is like, yeah, we just don't think we can have the kind of life we want if we give people of color an equal shot. And I'm like, well, then we can have a conversation, and we've kept talking. So I believe in fairness more than objectivity. I don't believe that journalists have to be activists. I think that there are people who are activist journalists. I think there are people who are mainstream journalists, some of whom are very self-aware, and some of whom don't think they have a self, which I completely resent and reject. And so I think that you can be on the activist side and be good or bad, and on the so-called mainstream or objective side and be good or bad. I think it's a question of being truthful and honest about yourself, and don't misrepresent who you are as you are a practitioner.
Well, I just want to say thank you all. I do want to ask our guests to give us just some final thoughts. And I know you've talked a lot, and we've covered a lot of things. There are a lot of things we would love to have another hour to talk about, and we still wouldn't completely fulfill every important idea. But both of you are doing important work. I thank you for the work you've already done. I thank you for the work that I know you're going to do. I thank you all for coming. And I just wanted to ask if I generally like to close an evening like this by asking, what would you like us to think about as we leave here?
Yeah.
So two things
I would say very briefly. One is history. So as I've grown as a journalist, I've also kept researching history. And so if you don't understand Reconstruction, understand it, because we're kind of going through the decline of Reconstruction all over again. And so understand how historical precedents about race and power and gender and power play out in the modern era. Understand your history. The second thing, and I'm getting the quote wrong, but paraphrasing, is follow Audre Lorde when she said that self-care is a form of political warfare. Don't let this season that we're in. And I don't think it's just an American thing. There's a global xenophobia. If you look at what's happening in Hungary, if you look at what's happening in the Philippines, if you look at the rise of far-right parties in Europe, we are in a season of a rise of xenophobia and, in many countries, fascism. And one of the ways to deal with that is to keep your well full. Don't let yourself run emotionally dry. Don't let yourself, fall apart. That's not going to help anyone.
I'm going to just, I want to give Rebecca the last word, so I'm just going to briefly interject to say, if I may, don't become the thing that you hate. Continue to listen well. Continue to engage people who don't already agree with you. Please don't become the very thing that you abhor. Don't forget who you are. And Rebecca, will you give us a final word as we go forth?
I don't think my word is going to measure up to yours. I would say just don't go back to sleep. I mean, this is, and I could not possibly agree more, that looking to history is crucial, and to remembering that we are in the midst of it right now. That all the important shifts did not happen in our past. They're happening around us right now. And it is so tempting. I mean, I hear this all the time from people like, oh, I just want to look away, and self-care is really important, and I agree with that too. But, and take care of yourself, but don't look away. Don't look away from what's happening. Keep reading, keep paying attention, stay, whatever it is you are, angry, sad, engaged, motivated, all of it. Don't just go back to what our normal was before this, because that's part of how we got here to begin with.
Thank you.
Yes. I just want to say that Debbie Walsh and I think this may be the best panel we have ever seen. It was fantastic. Thank you so very much. I also want to add that 2,400 people joined this conversation online. So a lot more were hearing what was going on, and this conversation will continue. Michel Martin, Rebecca Traister, Farai Chideya, thank you so very much.